Hey, welcome back to 10-Minute Apologetics. So I wanted to share with you probably one of my favorite passages in the Bible, and it's one of my favorites because it really helps us understand where almost everyone we can share the gospel or answer questions about the Bible, where they're coming from if they're not a follower of Jesus. They may be an atheist, they may be a Muslim, they may be a Buddhist, they may be agnostic, a Jehovah's Witness. Basically, anyone who rejects the one true God of the Bible. We may think we're dealing with all kinds of different things, but at least in a way, we're really dealing with people who are at the same stage, who just seem to come from different perspectives, but they all share one common trait. They all reject the God of the Bible, the one true God, and they either make up no God to replace him, which basically says they want to be their own God, according to atheism or maybe a New Age philosophy or something like that. They say there is no God. Well, anyway, we're going to get to that. And somebody who worships a false God or a God that doesn't actually exist, maybe gods of Greek mythology or Allah in the Muslim faith, or in Buddhism is sort of an atheistic faith. They don't worship Buddha, but they follow his teachings. Or Confucianism, or any other sort of philosophy or religion that's out there. It shares the common standpoint. And the whole passage is Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. And Romans is the perfect book of the Bible. It outlines the gospel from chapter 1 to chapter 16. All of Romans basically shares the gospel piece by piece. It's really exciting. And so when we start with Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation, first for the Jew and also for the Gentile." This wasn't planned in my teaching today, but when you think about it, sometimes, when I talk to people, I'm like, I want to convince them, and I want to use my intellect and my reason to just show them that God is real, and that the gospel is real, and they need to follow God, as if it's up to me or my own wisdom for them to know the truth. But what is the power of God to salvation? Is it my wisdom, my ability to reason? Is it my intellect? No, it is the gospel, the good news about Jesus. And so that's kind of the foundations of Romans. And in Romans chapter 1, it tells us what the state is of everyone who does not believe in the one true God. And Romans 1:18 says, "But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." So it says they suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now let me ask you a question. Can you suppress something you don't know? Can you suppress something you don't have? No. You can only suppress. By the way, the word suppress means to push down or keep hidden. So they know the truth about God, and they suppress it. They push it down. And everyone knows the truth. Well, how do we know that everyone knows the truth? Well, that's the next verse. Starting in verse 19, it says they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. How has he made it obvious to them? Well, it tells you in verse 20, "For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, so they have no excuse for not knowing God." So think about this. A person may say, "Well, I don't believe in God. There's no evidence God exists." Well, the reality is there is evidence. It's all around them. And that's the amazing thing. All of us are born with this intuition, this just idea that we don't have to reason it out or think about it. We just know inside that God exists. We know that he's real because we look at the earth, we look at the sky, we look at the stars, and we think it's obvious to us, this didn't come about by accident. It didn't just happen. Somebody designed it, because we have an intuition when we see things that are designed. You see a computer, you see a car, you see all these parts in an engine all working together to create internal combustion and make the car work. We know that it wasn't just a tornado going through a junkyard that somehow magically, made this come together. We see this intricate arrangement of parts, and we see the hand of a designer. And we know in this case it's a human designer, but how much bigger a designer for the entire universe. We know this when we're a child, and yet somehow when we get older, we want to challenge this belief. And we want to say, well, and what's the difference? I mean, we used to believe in Santa Claus when we were kids, maybe, but we no longer believe Santa Claus exists. The difference is, we were taught that Santa Claus was real by our parents, or somebody told us that Santa Claus was real. It wasn't an intuition that we had, that presents magically appeared under our Christmas tree. But with God, it's an intuition that he is real and that he exists. And in further episodes of 10-Minute Apologetics, I can't wait to get into intelligent design and science and more of the cool stuff and ways that we can know, even intellectually, how amazing and awesome God is. But belief in Santa Claus, we outgrow. So everyone, there's no excuse for someone saying, oh, I don't believe in God. He didn't tell me. He didn't write his name up in the sky and say, hey, Chris, here I am. God, I am real. In fact, if I didn't want to believe in God, I would have said, well, there must be some other explanation for this. Everyone will always come up with some excuse. If they don't want to believe in God strongly enough, they'll come up for a reason. And I think we see that all the time. And in fact, reading on in Romans, it tells us why. So verse 21 says, yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshipped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. In those days, they worshipped idols made of stone, and they worshipped trees and things like that. I mean, and people like that still exist. And people make up all kinds of alternative gods, or say there is no God. Or if they worship a false god, like the Muslim god, or the god of some other religion, Zeus, Apollo, Dionysus, Isis, Horus, Set, Egyptian gods. Those are gods that are just made up by the human imagination. And I skipped a bunch of verses after verse 23, but verse 28 says, since they thought it foolish to acknowledge God, he abandoned them to their foolish thinking and let them do things that should never be done. So men have no excuse for saying, well, God never told me that he existed. It's obvious. God already through creation made it obvious that he exists. And some might say that, we learn that God exists because we grow in our knowledge of science. I know I used to believe when I was a child that God was real, but, now I learned science, and science disproves God. We used to say, well, God explains lightning and God explains thunder, but now we know how lightning and thunder are created. So boom, that gap is filled by science, and we no longer need God to explain that. And that happens more and more. I didn't need God to explain how humans came about because the theory of evolution, Darwin solved that problem. Richard Dawkins, world famous atheist, said that Charles Darwin finally made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist because he gave us a reason that we don't need God to explain, the existence of complex biological life. But that's absolutely false. All of that is false. In fact, this is what I love about science. The more science progresses, the more it shows the glory and majesty and the absolute necessity of God to explain all the things that we see. I mean, imagine this. In Darwin's day, I think he wrote Origin of the Species in 1859. In those days, the smallest a microscope could see was the cell. And all they could see of a cell was a little blob of protoplasm, like a little blob of jelly. And that was as simple as they thought life got. And so they could, explain, some that these cells just joined together and, with natural selection and a long period of time. Eventually things got to where we are. And I'm not going to get too much into evolution. But here's what happened. They invented the electron microscope in the 1950s, and they could see into the cell. And inside the cell, far from it being simple, was this exquisite world of circuits and nanotechnology and little molecular machines that fit together that were far more amazing than anything human beings could even comprehend. In fact, Bill Gates said that DNA looks uncannily like computer code, only far more complex. And computer programmers write code. Computer code doesn't write itself. It requires a programmer. And so when we see this complexity, when we look through our telescopes, and, back in hundreds of years ago, all they saw were planets and the moon and the things that they could see with their eyes. And now we know so much more about the laws of physics and everything that is just perfectly constructed that governs this universe. The more science progresses, the more necessary God is to explain it all. It's absolutely amazing. And I'm really excited to go on this journey with you and talk about like the science and all of these things further. But what I want you to understand is when you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in God or may seem like they don't believe in God, the reality is deep down, everyone has an intuition that God is real because he's made it obvious to them through his creation. So have confidence. You're just sort of removing some of those barriers that they have to acknowledging, unsuppressing the truth that they've suppressed. And sometimes, when they say, oh, there's just no good reason to believe in God and they have intellectual arguments, doesn't really come down to intellectual arguments because we win that because God is the designer and owner of reason in the first place. And without God, reason wouldn't exist because God made a logical universe in which reason is possible, and God is the one who's given us reason. All right, well, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. You could read Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32 on your own to get a little more background in it. I hope you do. And I look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe. God bless you.